like I don't want to say they weren't sharing, but it was more prevalent, with the more British rock bands and, the UK and Europe,
Yeah,
and then the American bands in the States and stuff.
And
that's
what
true.
there wasn't like the internet, you didn't see people's faces all the
Hmm.
time, so maybe they were
Yeah,
familiar with their music but wouldn't know what they looked like. And
that's fair.
also they were kind of on like the fringe, like they're like more of like a counterculture thing, so maybe they just wouldn't have been known to most people at that time.
Right.
Yeah, because I mean, the most you would see of a picture of anybody, like for instance with him, would maybe be if they took a picture of him when he was in, you know, the court system getting, tried for whatever, or an album cover that he was on. I mean,
Yeah.
and he could look drastically different from any of those pictures that when they were taken.
Especially because he had gained weight too. Yeah.
Right.
Right, since he has a beard and stuff.
Yeah. So there's also that same drug dealer sold Janis Joplin her like final dose of heroin that took her out too, and he kind of bragged about it. So that's kind of an interesting little fact. Not bragged about it, but he took credit for it. Um,
Yeah, that's weird.
yeah, yeah, good job, dude. You killed two of like the most famous people of that time. I don't know. That's not cool. Um, But this could maybe be tied into the fact that possibly the CIA took out Jim Morrison because this was like the COINTELPRO era, right? Like
Oh,
where
yeah.
they're literally assassinating people and blackmailing them, and they've come out and said that they did some of these things to people at that time. Um, so I guess it's far fetched, but not that far fetched because we know they did do that. And it's possible that the drug dealer was also like a CIA operative
Oh,
because he would have had a lot of inside information about the people in that like crowd, the social circle, I guess I should say. And to have claimed that he sold Janis Joplin her lethal
yeah.
dose. Like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe he's just bad at giving people drugs, but.
The worst drug dealer ever.
Right.
Yeah, the worst one. Hey, I'm not going to go off on too much of a tangent, but kind of going off of the CIA's theory that they killed him. You guys need to cover Midnight Operation Midnight Climax in the future.
Oh.
That's a really good. It's a really good one.
I think that's on our list.
Okay, good. I was about to say because this is
Like, that kind of ties in with, like, MK Ultra, but we kind of don't get a lot of views on anything that talks poorly about the U.S. government. So,
well, that's fair.
I mean, those
That's
are
fair.
my
Can add it
favorite
to our
though. So,
list.
yeah.
Yeah. Once in a while.
Well, but that ties right into that theory, of the CIA, dosing people with different things and seeing what happens. So I mean, it very well could have been something that extreme of a conspiracy.
Yeah. I mean, I believe it. I 100% believe they would.
Was he like that much of a pain though for them to kill him?
I mean, he was causing riots.
But like barely, I feel like.
I mean, look what they did to Karen Silkwood.
Well, I think a good way to think about it too would be, during that time, you had like a huge culture shift that happened, and anybody that was at the forefront of that culture shift, for instance, the artists of the day, the Janis Joplins, the Jimi Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, or Jim Morrison and the Doors. I mean, they were writing music that the culture was loving at that time, and they were being rambunctious and rebellious against authority figures. So I mean,
That's
they
true.
might have seen it as a pretty credible threat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then here is my favorite theory that Jim Morrison was actually working for the CIA because his dad. Okay, this is. So it's possible that he was a CIA like operative himself. His father was like a high-ranking Navy official and was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which started the Vietnam War and like is now widely known as a false flag. And it could have been kind of a distraction. I don't know. I guess I have a hard time marrying up how what he was doing would have been used by the government, but they were really into distracting people from other important things that were happening at the time. So who knows with that. But he had a very high IQ, like we said before. And before their first album, he didn't have any musical experience. He does not play any instruments. He never wanted to play any instruments. He didn't sing. He didn't do anything. And he supposedly wrote all of this music, including the like instrumentals, on an acid trip. And somehow they were able to play it, but he couldn't write it down, and he couldn't play the instruments to tell anyone how to play it, like to show anyone the music either. So it's like really odd that he wrote all this music, but he couldn't have, basically. I mean, maybe he heard it all, but how would you even go about teaching someone else to play something you heard one time in your head? And it's an entire 2 albums worth of music. And none of the other band members had any musical experience before that either. So it does feel like very fabricated. Where did they come up with all this music? How did they even do this?
Industry plants.
Yeah, exactly. Like it doesn't feel authentic or feel like it could have happened the way they say it happened. And another thing that maybe, Jake, you can speak to this, during the entire time the band existed, the lineup never changed, no one quit, no one freaked out and had differences of opinion or artistic choice. They all just did it. And like a lot of the other bands at that time had a lot of people coming in and out and switching up who played what because they got in fights all the time.
Well, I think that would attribute mostly to, like you just said, they all just kind of got together and started doing weird noises on their instrument. And I mean, that could attribute to why I don't like them, is because they're not very talented, in my opinion. Once again, listeners, I'm sorry. But no, yeah, that's probably the main reason why, is because a lot of other bands, you know, they kind of were in the trenches together for a while, you know, coming up as the next hot thing they were the overnight success that started 6 years ago. You know what I mean? So they're already used to being at each other's throats. And then when they get all the fame and fortune and then they think all that's going to go away, it's not going to go away. You're just going to have a lot of money and still fight each other.
Right. I mean, I guess that's a good point. And the other thing is, people say that they were actually really horrible live, but it was just so theatrical that, like, it distracted people from how bad it was. Like, they weren't good. They didn't know how to play their instruments.
Yeah, what?
Once again, this is just opinion, listeners. It's just opinion. If you love the Doors, we're not saying anything bad about you.
Yeah, just about them, just about the Doors.
Right.
Yeah, just them. They suck.
Yeah, this makes more sense. The one song I didn't like, 'cause it did not sound like it went together at all.
Yeah. And I listened to this audiobook about like the counterculture and the CIA in Laurel Canyon at that time. And there was like a lot of stuff that kind of pointed at the CIA being involved. Maybe not necessarily causing things, but they were at least keeping really close tabs on the people involved in that like social circle. And they were like, there were people that definitely were handlers, and people moved from band to band and were like probably CIA informants. And like some of those, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I mean, that's the thing. I think the government really freaked out over that whole movement that happened in the early 60s. You know, it just like kind of came out of nowhere, and then everybody was wanting to be a part of it, and it was counter to the norm. Like you said, that counterculture just rose up out of nowhere. And so, yeah, I'm sure they had people embedded trying to figure out what was going on with that whole thing and influencing it the best they could as well.
And another thing is that Jim Morrison's childhood friend was the guy who owned the Whiskey A Go-Go, and they were both like military kids. So they were connected in that way. And there was some like talk that the owner of the Whiskey A Go-Go was involved with the CIA too. So it could have been possible that Morrison was planted into this culture and told fit in, and he was kind of a weirdo anyway, because he was like, when he was in film school, his projects were like fucked up, like, excuse my language, but he did some really like avant-garde stuff that was pretty edgy.
Well, probably comes from the lovely conversations his father and him had.
Right.
Or maybe that was his father training him early, grooming him to be a CIA implant.
Right? Who knows? That's what they say. I mean, it's hard to know, but he is so smart that it wouldn't surprise me if they said, hey, you have a kid that age, let's just... And he's like, who knows?
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
they did some really strange things at that time. And like, I guess part of this theory would go that the CIA helped him fake his own death and start a new life once they had gotten what they wanted out of him, or saw that he was like on the edge of dying.
See, I don't think they would have let him live, though. I mean, they probably would have just cut ties with it. You know
That's
what I mean?
true.
They wouldn't have, you know, it's at that point you got a guy that supposedly drinks way too much, which that was noted by other people. That's not something you're just going to get rid of just because you're not in the world anymore of rock and roll, you know. So he might have became somewhat of a liability if that was the case, if he was actually by the CIA. So probably just let him die, or just kill him if they had to.
Yeah, that's really true. And the final theory is that he faked his own death, which the keyboardist Ray Manzarek was like a huge supporter of this theory, because there were like multiple conversations before this happened where he basically said he wanted to pull a death stunt to get more media attention for the band. And one of the last conversations they had with him was him asking how the album was doing. So it's possible that he said, oh, it's not doing so great, I'm gonna fake my own death, because he had 2 kids at this time, and maybe he wanted to like provide for them because they would have gotten his like money. And he also said that he was thinking about making a radical change in careers and would reappear as a businessman, and repeatedly asked the record company how a sudden death might affect business and record sales. There have been a lot of claimed sightings of him after he died, and there was also something, and I didn't write this down because the source seemed a little sketchy, but there was a CIA operative also named James Douglas Morrison, who was active after the first Jim Morrison would have died, and was, I don't know, it was hard to follow, but there is like paper trail of this other Jim Morrison that was operating after the rock star Jim Morrison died. Not that it's a super uncommon name, but there was a lot to that I just couldn't even. I was like, this is too much.
That probably means it's the most true conspiracy theory. When you can't even follow the words that you're trying to read, it's just like, yep, this one's it.
Yeah. I don't know. And it's also a little suspicious that after he died, they had a doctor come in, they had the police come in, and then like funeral directors, they like immediately put him in the casket and closed it. Like right away. The casket was never opened again, and he was buried within 2 days. No one saw him except basically the doctors, the police, and Pamela Corsons. And a lot of the band members say, like, how do we know he was actually in there? Which, again, kind of, I mean, how do you ever know that someone's in there? But based on the conversations, it seemed like this was something that he would do, and everyone said that if anyone was going to do it and get away with it, it would be him.
Well,